Moving beyond the culture wars, I think it's just an expression of my belief that we have become so polarized in this country that we are tearing it apart. And it's bleeding into every aspect of public life and politics and religion. And I think we can and we should do better. I think we can disagree about issues without throwing flames at each other. And we can respect people who we disagree with and maybe even try to imagine what it's like from the perspective of those we disagree with. Today I'm going to be talking about how we need each other, those who are conservatives and those who are liberals. And I'm using a resource I mentioned a couple weeks ago, a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And the key words in that title are good and righteous. We are all good people on both sides, with a few exceptions. There are bad actors. There are people who really do not have good intentions. But most people on both sides of the issue, conservative or liberal, are good people. The other key word is righteous. A couple weeks ago I talked about Haidt's metaphor of the elephant and the rider, which he uses in several of his books. And the elephant is our moral intuition. It is the accumulation of both what we have inherited genetically and evolutionary, and then our cultural environment, which gives us this moral intuition that we are essentially first born with and then grow into before we even have language to speak about and understand what's going on. And it's that part of us that is, he says, is 99% of our makeup. Emotional, intuitional baggage, weight, that we have that teaches us to dislike and like things. And we are moral by nature. We give it a moral framework. Then the rider is the 1% of us that rides atop of that. And it's our mind, our reasoning capacity. And that we have some ability, if we are aware that we are riding this elephant, to steer the course. But most of the time what happens is that we simply ride the elephant and we use our reason to justify the direction that we are heading. And he says that we all, in doing that, we develop these moral narratives. We are a narrative by nature. We tell a story about ourselves. And we develop this moral narrative that justifies the direction our elephant heads. And we all have a moral narrative. And he gives examples, a number of examples in the book of the different kinds of moral narratives that speak to concerns that we have. And I want to read two of them, two typical moral narratives. One is a liberal moral narrative that has a bit of a libertarian twinge to it. It goes like this. Once upon a time, the vast majority of human persons suffered in societies and social institutions that were unjust, unhealthy, repressive, and oppressive. These traditional societies were reprehensible because of their deep-rooted inequality, exploitation, and irrational traditionalism. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity struggled mightily against the forces of misery and oppression, and eventually succeeded in establishing modern, liberal, democratic, capitalistic welfare societies. While modern social conditions hold the potential to maximize individual freedom and pleasure of all, there is much work to be done to dismantle the powerful vestiges of inequality, exploitation, and repression. This struggle for a good society in which individuals are equal and free to pursue their self-defined happiness is the one mission truly worth dedicating one's life to achieving. Now, he says liberals today tend to argue among themselves about the benefits of capitalism. But classical liberalism embraced capitalism because it saw the economic system as a way to be free from feudalism or from communism. But in this moral narrative, the liberal values of fairness and individual self-expression are reflected. And the evil that is to be battled against is authority and hierarchy and tradition, anytime they get in the way of human freedom. So that's kind of a typical liberal moral narrative. Here's a conservative moral narrative, which is one of several that he outlines. And this one, he says, he calls it the Ronald Reagan narrative. Once upon a time, America was a shining beacon. Then liberals came along and erected an enormous federal bureaucracy that handcuffed the invisible hand of the free market. They subverted our traditional American values and opposed God and faith at every step of the way. Instead of requiring that people work for a living, they siphoned money from hardworking Americans and gave it to Cadillac-driving drug addicts and welfare queens. I can tell where I'm coming from because it just makes me smile to read it. This isn't my narrative. Instead of punishing criminals, they tried to understand them. Instead of worrying about the victims of crime, they worried about the rights of criminals. Instead of adhering to traditional American values of family, fidelity, and personal responsibility, they preached promiscuity, premarital sex, and gay lifestyle. They encouraged a feminist agenda that undermined traditional family roles. Instead of projecting strength to those who would do evil around the world, they cut military budgets, disrespected our soldiers in uniform, burned the flag, and chose negotiation and multilateralism. Then Americans decided to take their country back from those who sought to undermine it. So this moral narrative reflects typical conservative values. Liberty as freedom from government constraint, fairness as proportionality, taking money from those who work hard and giving it to welfare queens, loyalty, soldiers and the flag, authority, subversion of the family and traditions, and sanctity, replacing God with celebration of promiscuity. So he says everyone constructs some kind of a moral narrative. They have a story to tell that justifies their beliefs. And even people who are apolitical construct a moral narrative to justify their non-involvement. The key thing to remember is that we have, from his perspective, we have an enormous amount of emotional energy devoted to this moral narrative. This is the elephant. We're riding this elephant that heads along and teaches us that this is the truth. This is the way the world works. And I'm right. And even if we can kind of step outside ourselves a little bit and say, I could be wrong occasionally, we don't really believe it. We believe that our side is right. Our moral narrative is the right one. One of the problems with the moral narratives that we create, he says, is that they often don't allow us to see any facts that might contradict the narrative. He says that there are blind spots in every moral narrative. And he gives some examples. Conservatives value tradition, order, and the institutions that preserve that order. And they tend to have a keen sense of what they talk about as fallen human nature. That left alone, we will mess things up. They don't have the typical liberal belief in progress that we can get better. And so they think those institutions are necessary to check us, to keep us in line, and to help us from acting out of our worst impulses. But they tend to have a blind spot when it comes to certain institutions. When they talk about the free hand of the market, for instance, they often completely fail to see that if the market is left free, that human nature tends to run roughshod over lots of people. And they need a check, which they, in their narrative, they just can't see that they need. The market needs to be free and unfettered. And this is the example he gives. He talks about the explosion of automobile ownership through the 1950s and 1960s, which led at the time to an incredible amount of lead being released into the atmosphere from tailpipes because gasoline had lead in it. And especially in cities, there was an incredible amount of lead that just kept building up in the air, and everyone was breathing it. And there was more and more evidence that that lead was causing all kinds of problems in health, especially the health of children. And yet, that evidence went against their moral narrative about the free hand of the market. And so they fought tooth and nail against regulating or eliminating lead in gasoline. And it was the chemical industry, it was the automobile industry, it was the Wall Street Journal, it was all of the institutions that supported that kind of moral framework. All of them, the Chamber of Commerce, all of them fought tooth and nail against any kind of regulation in getting lead out of tailpipes.